So this shit is nuts, man. You're not gonna believe what I just found, and this shit validates everything I've said about the native movement, which has a headquarters in Fairbanks and a headquarters in Anchorage. And on my previous video, I said that they were an astroturfed Zionist organization with ties to war criminals. And this is true. This is true, man. They're a liberal Zionist astroturfed organization. So we went over how they were collaborating with people who collaborate with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, which is a Zionist organization that takes money from the Rockefellers, right? We went over that in a previous video, right? And we went over how Jessica Gerard, who works for the Native Movement, is a war criminal, right? And committed war crimes in Iraq. Now, this further proves what I've been saying all along, that the Native Movement's an astroturfed Zionist psyop, right? So, here's how, so notice that the Native Movement plays both sides on the topic of Palestine and runs cover for Zionist squatters. They vilify Hamas and they portray Zionist terrorists as innocent, okay? They vilify Hamas once again. And here, down here, they play both sides. They play both sides and they run cover for Zionist squatters. They said they weep with Zionist squatters. They once again run cover for Zionist squatters. And they glorify and out themselves as associates of the NDN Collective. You know, the same astroturf liberal Zionist organization that takes money from Jeff Bezos and the Rockefellers. So, and they call for a ceasefire which would disarm the Palestinian resistance. Okay. And they call for the safe passage of Zionist squatters. Bruh, Zionist squatters must be arrested and extradited to their countries of origin to face war crimes charges. And then they use the equal rights framework as opposed to the decolonization framework. An end to apartheid. And they don't even mention decolonization. They don't even mention the obliteration of the Zionist entity or the extradition of Zionist squatters. Equal rights? What, equal rights in a settler colony where Palestinians are still treated as fourth-class citizens? And look at who they provide for information and contacts. If Not Now, funded by the Rockefellers. JVP, funded by the Rockefellers. NDN Collective, funded by Jeff Bezos and the Rockefellers. The Working Family Parties, that's a liberal Zionist organization. Democracy Now, yet another liberal Zionist organization. And the NDN Collective, they sound quite similar to the Native Movement. Look at, they're quoting liberal Zionist Ilhan Omar. And they're vilifying Hamas. Again, look, the NDN Collective normalizes Zionist squatters and Zionist gatekeepers. They play the both sides. They try to play both sides on genocide and settler colonialism. and they pray for the safe return of Zionist squatters, which, these Zionist squatters should be extradited to their countries of origin. And they call for a ceasefire which would disarm the Palestinian resistance. And they vilify Hamas. So, NDN Collective's a joke. NDN Collective's a total joke. Oh, and this is the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. Mohammed Abu Nimer has ties to USAID. And he's been doing interfaith dialogue in Egypt, Mindanao, Palestine, Sri Lanka. Oh boy. And he's just been a senior advisor to the KACIID Dialogue Center. That guy's bad news. That guy is a gatekeeper and a grifter. And then you have this idiot Peter Weinberger, and he's developed multiple training programs for USAID, the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Again, this guy's affiliated with the parent group of the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. And with guys with names like Weinberger and Kirschbaum, who's their director, and with the Awad family, who are big sellouts and grifters, and have ties to, disgraced university professor Gene Clark of Willamette University, who's also a Zionist. Again, Mubarak Awad's an adjunct professor at American University. These guys are bad news. Again, Jonathan Katab, he's a sellout and a grifter. But this is the type of people that, they're at Nonviolence International. They're taking in big bucks from the Rockefellers, as I previously exposed in my previous video. These guys are being promoted by the liberal Zionist native movement. And I wanted to read this because, again, I'm part Palestinian. I have family from occupied 1948 Palestine, and I can show you. So about 15.47% of my ancestry is Lebanese and Palestinian, specifically from the north of Palestine and the Haifa Governorate as well. So I have family in Daliat al-Carmel, I have family in Esfia, I have family in Maghar, in Yarka, Bet Jan, those particular areas. My closest DNA match, my second closest DNA match, is Palestinian Druze, right? 2.03 Euclidean distance, right? Also, I have another DNA match, which is descended from both Palestinian Druze and Palestinian Orthodox Christians from Bet Sahur. Okay. And yet another one with a Euclidean distance of 2.39 from Palestinian Druze. So you do the math. I'm part Palestinian. But the fact that the native movement, which is a astroturfed Zionist organization, erases Palestinians from 1948 Palestine, which we're going to read about just in a second here from Ebb Magazine, that says a lot. So this is the Ebb Magazine article I just referenced. This is Anti-Zionism as Decolonization by Leila Shomali and Lara Kilani. Great article. I don't have time to read the whole thing, but I do want to break down the basics. It says, it says many new activists and reactivated organizers seek to translate Their emotional responses to tangible support for Palestine. They are also searching for community hubs, often in the forms of organizations that confront Zionism and colonialism. Through cause of this genocide, whether activists know it or not, they are looking for an anti-Zionist home for their organizing efforts. It is exactly the moment, therefore, to provide an honest discussion on some of the essential characteristics of this organizing rooted firmly in the principles of Palestinian liberation and decolonization, peeling away any remaining layers of confusion and mystery. This essay aims to open the overdue conversation with some suggestions for individuals to consider as they search for their anti-Zionist organizing home. So if we accept as those with the most rudimentary understanding of history do that Zionism is an ongoing process of settler colonialism, then the undoing of Zionism requires anti-Zionism, which should be understood as a process of decolonization. Anti-Zionism as a decolonial ideology then becomes rightly situated as an indigenous liberation movement. This implication is twofold. First, decolonial organizing requires that we extract ourselves from the limitations of existing structures of powers and knowledge and imagine a new just world. Second, this understanding clarifies that the caretakers of anti-Zionist thought are indigenous communities resisting colonial erasure, and it is from this analysis that the strategies, modes, and goals of decolonial praxis should flow. In simpler terms, Palestinians committed to decolonization, not Western-based NGOs like the Native Movement, which has an office in Fairbanks and an office in Anchorage, are the primary authors of anti-Zionist thought. We write this as a Palestinian and a Palestinian American who live and work in Palestine and have seen the impact of so-called Western values and now the centering of human rights. The human rights paradigm disrupts real decolonial efforts in Palestine and abroad. This is carried out in favor of maintaining the status quo and gaining proximity to power using slogans emptied of Palestinian historical analysis. Anti-Zionist organizing is not a new notion, but until now the use of the terms in organizing circles has been mired with misunderstandings, vague definitions, or outright minimized. Some have incorrectly described anti-Zionism as amounting to activities or the thought limited to critiques of the present Zionist regime. This is a dangerous misrepresentation. Understanding anti-Zionism as decolonization requires the articulation of a political movement with material articulated goals, the restitution of ancestral territories, and upholding the inviolable principle of indigenous repatriation through the right of return, coupled with the destruction of Zionist structures and the reconstruction of governing frameworks that are conceived, directed, and implemented by Palestinians. Like I said, I will regulate all the areas around my family's villages. I will arrest every single Zionist squatter. I will extradite those Zionist squatters to their countries of origin, whether they like it or not, okay? Anti-Zionism illuminates the necessity to return power to the indigenous community and the need for the frameworks of justice and accountability for the settler communities that have waged a bloody, unrelenting 100-year war on the people of Palestine. It means that anti-Zionism is much more than a slogan. And I want to point out here, real quick, before we get back to the article here, that the Native Movement has a Russian Ashkenazi Jew on their staff. That's right, Ruth Miller. And guess what, guys? Ruth Miller also has a degree from none other than Ivy League institution, Brown University. You know, far from working class there. Oh, and she also went to West Anchorage High. A ver, where is this? So it formed in 2003 out of Arctic Village. Oh, they're from the interior. No wonder why they're hella astroturfed, man. Oh, you have this stupid asshole who was on what's it called? That one TV channel based out of LA that Eddie the House Cat Smith was on. And then she posed for Vogue magazine. She's a sellout. Brittany, she was on Jubilee. This person was on, remember she wore the red cussbuck? She was on the Hunters versus Vegans episode. Who doesn't remember that? But yeah, she sold out to Jubilee because she's a clout chaser. Guys, I will never sell out to Jubilee. You will never catch me selling out to Jubilee because I'm not a sellout. Dude, where is the bio of sellout? Oh, Ruth Miller. Denina Athabaskan, a Russian Ashkenazi Jew. Ruth is a Denina Athabaskan and Russian Ashkenazi Jew raised in Anchorage, Alaska. She's a member of the Kuryong tribe and also has roots in Bristol Bay, where her family descended downriver after leaving the Lake Iliamna region. She's a recent graduate of Brown University, built on occupied Wampanoag and Narragansett lands, and received a BA in Critical Developmental Studies with a focus on Indigenous resistance and liberation. Again, she's a college-educated opportunist. She's a sellout. She's not a working-class person. So, and she's also an Ashkenazi, a Russian Ashkenazi Jew. So are we really surprised that this is one of their staff members? That, again, the Native Movement is a liberal Zionist organization. A liberation movement. So back to the article here. A liberation movement. Given the implications of defining anti-Zionism, we must reorient ourselves around it within the framework of a liberation movement. Again, I'm a college dropout, so you will never see me sell out to any academic institutions in America. You understand? So back to the article here. A liberation movement, given the implications of defining anti-Zionism, we must reorient ourselves around it within the framework of a liberation movement. This emphasizes the strategic importance of control over the narrative and principles of anti-Zionism in the context of global decolonial efforts. As Stephen Saleta points out, and Hamas is a figment of your imagination, Zionism and liberal Zionism continue to influence the shape of Palestinian resistance. Zionists have a rhetorical control in the public sphere. They get to determine the culture of the native. They get to prescribe and proscribe the contours of resistance. They get to adjudicate the work of national liberation. Palestinians are entrapped by the crude and self-serving imagination of the oppressor. So we got to put in some clinch work, and we have to wrestle back our right to narration and can use anti-Zionist thought as a guide for liberation. We must reclaim anti-Zionist praxis from those who would only use it as a headline in a fundraising email. You know, like the Native Movement, like If Not Now, J Street, JVP, like the NDN Collective, like International Nonviolence, for example, just to name a few. So we got to do our clinch work, and we have to wrestle back our right to narration and can use anti-Zionist thought as a guide for liberation. We must reclaim anti-Zionist praxis from those who would only use it as a headline for a fundraising email. While our collective imaginations have not fully articulated what a liberated and decolonized Palestine looks like, come on, we know what it is. It's from the river to the sea. All Zionist squatters must be extradited to their countries of origin and put in prison, right? That's a fact. And any Druze that collaborate, if you're Druze and you collaborate with the Zionists, I will put you in prison. It doesn't matter if you are my relative, right? Because, again, most of my Palestinian family is Druze, D-R-U-Z-E. So, yeah. But I'm not. I'm Muslim. So while our collective imaginations have not fully articulated what a liberated and decolonized Palestine looks like, the rough contours have been laid out repeatedly. Ask any Palestinian refugee displaced from Haifa, the lands of Sheikh Moanis, or Deir Yassin, and they will tell you that a decolonized Palestine is at a minimum the right of Palestinians' return to an autonomous political unit from the river to the sea. When self-proclaimed anti-Zionists, like the Native Movement, use rhetoric like Israel-Palestine or with Palestine-Israel, We wonder, where do you think Israel exists? On which land does it lay if not Palestine? This is nothing more than an attempt to legitimize a colonial state. The name you are looking for is Palestine. No hyphen required. At a minimum, anti-Zionist formations should cut out the language that forces upon Palestinians and non-Palestinian allies the violence of colonial theft. And that is something that the Native movement is really guilty of. You know what I mean? Oh, and Ashkenazi Jew Ruth Miller and war criminal Jessica Girard work for them. Oh, an Obama operative, Princess Johnson, works for them. You know what I mean? The settler-native relationship. Understanding the settler-native relationship is essential in anti-Zionist organizing. It means confronting the settler designation in Zionist settler colonialism, a class status indicating one's place in the larger settler colonial systems of power. Anti-Zionist discourse should critically challenge the Zionist reframing of history through colonial instruments such as the Oslo Accords and an over-reliance on international law frameworks through which they differentiate Zionist squatters in Tel Aviv and those in West Bank settlements. Suggesting that some Zionist cities are settlements while others are not perpetuates Zionist framing, granting legitimacy to colonial control, according to arbitrary geographical divisions of Palestine and further dividing the land into disparate zones. Anti-Zionist analysis understands that settlers are not only residents of illegal West Bank settlements like Kiryat Arba and Efrat, but also those in Safad and Petah Tikva. Ask any Palestinian who is living in exile from Haifa, like me, right? Dalit el-Karmel is in Haifa Governorate. That's my hometown in Palestine. They will tell you that the Zionist squatters living in their homes are also settlers. The common choice to center the Oslo Accords, international humanitarian law, and human rights paradigm over socio-historical Palestinian realities not only limits our analysis and political interventions, but it also restricts our imagination of what kind of future Palestinians deserve, sidelining questions of decolonization to convince us that it is the new bad settlers in the West Bank who are the source of the violence. Legitimate settlers who reside in the bounds of Palestinian geography stolen in 1948, like Tel Aviv and West Jerusalem, are different within this narrative. Like breaking the silence, they can only be enlightened by learning the error of colonial violence carried out in the service of the bad settlers. They can supposedly even be our solidarity partners, all without having to sacrifice a crumb of colonial privilege or denounce pre-1967 Zionist violence in any of its cruel manifestations. As a result of this course of thought, solidarity organizations often showcase particular Zionist squatters, those who renounce state violence in the service of the bad settlers in their ongoing colonization in the West Bank, in roles as professionals and peacemakers, positioning them on an equal intellectual, moral, or class footing with Palestinians. There is no recognition of the inherent imbalance of power between these Zionist squatters and Palestinians they purport to be in solidarity with, stripping away their settler status. The settler is taken out of the historical political context which afforded them the privileged status on stolen land, and it is given the power to delineate the Palestinian experience. This is part of the historical occlusion of the Zionist narrative, overlooking the context of the settler colonialism to read the settler as an individual and omitting their class status as the settler. So, So anti-Zionism cannot shy away between employing the historical political definitions of settlers and indigenous in their discourse to affront ahistorical readings of Palestinian decolonial thought and Zionist propaganda. That's another thing. So the Zionist version of all lives matter. As we see, settler colonialism secures the position of the settler in imbuing them with rights, in this case, the divine right of conquest. As such, Zionism ensures that settlers' rights supersede those of indigenous people, at the latter's expense. Knowing this the liberal slogan, equal rights for all people, requires deeper consideration. Rather than placing the emphasis on deconstruction of the settler state and violence inherent to it, which eternally serves the settler to the direct detriment of the indigenous communities, the slogan suggests that Palestinians simply need to secure more rights within the violent system. Again, the Native movement is, let's look at their statement. The Native movement is guilty of this. The equal rights paradigm instead of the full liberation and decolonization paradigm, right? So rather than placing the emphasis on deconstruction of the settler state and the violence inherent to it, which eternally serves the settler to the direct detriment of indigenous communities, the slogan suggests that Palestinians simply need to secure more rights within the violent system. But equal rights in the sense that those chanting this phrase mean them will not come from attempts to rehabilitate a settler state. They can only be ensured through the decolonization of Palestine through the material restitution of land and resources. Without further discussion, the slogan simply serves as another mechanism of Zionism, one that maintains the rights of the settler rather than emphasizing the need to restore rights to the indigenous communities who have long been the victims of settlers' rights. Anti-Zionists cannot both denounce settler colonialism and Zionism and center advocacy on the claim that settlers should have equal immutable rights. Zionists would have you believe that their state has always existed and that Zionist squatters have always lived on the land, but a brief reference to recent history reminds us that anti-Zionism must confront the ongoing mechanisms materially advancing the development of colonies in Palestine. So in 2022 alone, the Zionist institutions invested almost $100 million, transferring some 60,000 new settlers from Russia, Eastern Europe, and the United States and France to help secure a demographic majority and ensure a physical presence on indigenous lands. This only happens by maintaining the forced displacement of Palestinians and by violently displacing them anew, as we see on a daily basis, particularly across the rural West Bank. There is no moral legitimacy in the suggestion that these settlers have a right to live on stolen Palestinian lands, the theft maintained by force as long as there has been no restoration of Palestinian rights. No theories of justice exist in mainstream ethical or political or philosophical discourse that advocate for a person who has stolen something to rightfully keep what they have taken. The act of theft, by definition, violates basic principles of theories of justice, which emphasize fairness, equitable distribution, and respect for individual rights and property. When liberal NGOs champion equal rights for all people, with no discussion of what that means, it is the Zionist version of all lives matter, perpetuating at best failing to question the maintenance of systems of violence against Palestinians. Having laid out some foundational concepts and definitions pertaining to Zionism and anti-Zionism, we can explore some essential strategies and tactics for anti-Zionist organizing. Okay? So, anti-Zionism necessitates that the systemic dismantling of Zionist structures. This may include educational programs and protests which serve as foundational activities. However, it is essential to be cautious of organizing spaces and activities that become comfort zones for activists lacking the necessary risk and meaningful challenges to existing structures of Zionist violence. Anti-Zionist organizing must involve strategic policy and legal reform that support decolonization from afar, such as targeting laws that enable international charities to fund Zionist squatter militias and settlement expansion. After all, our aim from abroad should be to make structural changes to advance decolonization, not simply shift public sentiment about Palestine. Decolonization approaches abroad include changing the internal structures of institutions that support colonization: charities, churches, synagogues, social clubs, and other donor institutions. This includes that entities that many international activists are personally, professionally, and financially linked to, such as the nonprofits we coordinate with, and large granting institutions like the Open Society Foundation and Carnegie Corporation of New York. In the context of the United States, the most threatening Zionist institutions are the entrenched political parties which function to maintain the status quo of the American empire, not Hillel groups on campus or even Christian Zionist churches. While the ADL and AIPAC engage in forms of violence that suppress Palestinian liberation and must not be minimized, it is crucial to recognize that the most consequential institutions in the context of settler colonialism, are not exclusively Jewish in their orientation or representation. The Republican and Democratic Party in the USA do arguably more to manufacture public consent for the slaughtering of Palestinians than the ADL and AIPAC combined. Even the Progressive Caucus and the majority of the Fraud Squad are guilty of this. These internal challenges to the institutions and communities we belong to are by definition risky and sacrificial, but essential and liberatory. They require confrontation and likely with the withholding of support and material resources in order to usher in change. As we have seen over the last few months, merely organizing protests to pressure politicians without explicit intent to withdraw electoral and financial support from political parties and institutions is flawed. It also does not secure the desired result. On November 28, 2023, in the midst of the Zionist entity's genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza, members of the U.S. House of Representatives voted 421 to 1, with the one unaligned to any decolonization movement, to support a bill that equates anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism. The members of the squad who did not vote for the bill did not vote against it. Politicians, organizational leaders, and funding institutions must see real political consequences of their decisions to support genocide. Reluctance within the executive leadership of international solidarity organizations to hold elected officials accountable is a red flag, as we cannot balance our loyalties between liberation and a temporary political convenience. Anti-Zionism requires more than political organizing that is targeted at those maintaining white supremacy through Zionism, like the Native movement. It requires that we wager our access to power to dismantle mechanisms of oppression. We must stop betting on the longevity of Zionism. When we properly decouple Zionism from Judaism and understand as a process of indigenous erasure and primitive resource accumulation, the dominant political formation, the armaments industry, and the high-tech security sector are easily understood as indispensable institutions in the broader Zionist project. These bodies also materially benefit from the status quo of Zionist colonization and therefore wield their power to maintain it. This is a larger part of the larger function of these formations to uphold white supremacy, imperialism, and colonialism globally. This helps us recognize Zionism does not serve to benefit Jewish people, even if this is not the primary reason we should abolish it. Equating Jewish community safety and prosperity with the safeguarding colonial violence is an anti-Semitic and fallacious argument. And also Judaism is a form of fascism too, in the present form, right? This relates early to the earlier discussion of understanding Palestinians as the authors and caretakers of anti-Zionist decolonial thought. We must be cautious not to portray anti-Zionism as belonging in any exclusive way to Jewish activists or requiring Jewish organizations' initiative. Characterizing anti-Zionism as a practice necessarily spearheaded by Jewish activists rather than acknowledging it as a decolonial praxis aimed at deconstructing institutions, maintaining the colonization of Palestine displaces Palestinian decolonial leadership. By placing undue emphasis on Jewish organizations, we decenter Palestinian knowledge, experience, and colonial efforts in favor of non-Palestinian agencies. This is a grave error. Such conflation not only misrepresents the objectives of anti-Zionism, but inadvertently contributes to the conflation or continuation of anti-Semitic sentiments by equating Judaism and colonialism. So, in bold solidarity, in summary, anti-Zionism is not a slogan, but a process of decolonization and liberation. Palestinians committed to resisting Zionism and erasure are caretakers of the political movement. Cities such as Tel Aviv and Modin are settlements, just like Itamar and Tel Rumeda and the West Bank. Decolonization does not imply displacement of all Jewish communities in Palestine. However, it is crucial to recognize that not every individual identifying as Jewish is indigenous to Palestine. This basic framework must be unabashedly articulated by anti-Zionist organizations and their allies in advocacy. Anti-Zionist organizing should move towards dismantling the colonial structures through changing the laws and policies of institutions and formations essential to the Zionist entity. This essay is not an exhaustive manual. Instead, it begins a much-needed conversation and presents central principles of anti-Zionist practices. These principles are non-negotiable and represent some of the markers for anti-Zionist organizing. These anti-Zionist indicators should not be sprinkled about through emails or social media posts that one has to dig for, but should be glaringly evident in our work and analysis. An organization's commitment to solidarity and conceptualization of resistance should be transparent. Its ideals should be clear to potential newcomers as well as its donors. We have seen too many times organizations intentionally obfuscate what they're standing for so they relate to a broad mass of people, while at the same time being more palatable to liberal donors. They use vague language about the future they envision, describing equality, justice, and a thriving future for all Palestinians and Zionist squatters, without a thoughtful discussion of what Palestinians will need to reach this prosperity. The dual discourse phenomenon, where contradictory messages are conveyed to grassroots supporters and financial donors, is a manipulative tactic for institutional and personal gain. It should be clear from the onset that a group's efforts have one ultimate goal. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Anti-Zionism and anti-solidarity should be bold. Palestinians deserve nothing less. So there you go. There you go. Again, the Native Movement is a liberal Zionist organization. Okay? Just like the Indian Collective, just like If Not Now, just like JVP, and yeah, the fact that they have Ruth Miller and Jessica Gerard working for them, and Desiree Princess Johnson working for them, they're an astroturfed liberal Zionist organization with a bunch of college-educated liberal NGO elitists working for them. They don't represent the interests of your ordinary people. They're a liberal Zionist organization. They're an astroturf liberal Zionist organization that's full of gatekeepers and grifters. That's what they are. So there you go.